stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies.
Just days before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Kamala Harris, then vice president, found herself at a critical crossroads. The Ukrainian president urgently pleaded with her to impose preventative sanctions on Russia and supply Ukraine with vital weaponry. His argument was clear. Early action could force Putin to reconsider his plans, but Harris turned him down. Now, as Harris stands on the brink of possibly becoming the next US president, a pressing question arises. What would her leadership mean for Ukraine, especially when the US might not want Russia to lose too much too fast or at all? Kamala Harris, a vocal advocate for sovereignty and human rights, has made her position on the Ukraine war abundantly clear.
If Putin takes aggressive action, we are prepared to levy serious and severe costs.
She also represented the US at the Peace Summit for Ukraine in June, where the US announced $1.5 billion in energy and humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. Her unwavering alignment with Ukraine's interests is also shown through her pick of Tim Walz as running mate. Walz isn't just a supporter of Ukraine in name. He has actively pushed policies that cut ties with Russian and Belarusian companies, supported arms production for Ukraine's defense, and welcomed Ukrainian refugees to Minnesota. His hands-on approach was evident when he held a virtual meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky in April 2023, cementing an agricultural partnership with Ukraine's Chernihiv region. This choice isn't just about political optics. It's a strategic alignment that could redefine the US's role in the ongoing conflict. But would her role as president be the same as Biden, or would she take a tough position, especially over Ukrainian topic? Advisors close to Harris suggest that her presidency might adopt a tougher stance toward Russia, with figures like her national security advisor Philip Gordon known for their pro-Ukraine views. A Harris administration could push for a more aggressive approach than Biden's current policy, particularly concerning military aid and sanctions. This alignment signals that Harris could represent a continuation, but with a sharper, more direct policy against Russian aggression, potentially increasing US involvement in the conflict through more assertive actions. But this is just a small pixel of the larger picture. Despite her lofty claims and unwavering support commitment, the US as a state has its own constraints when it comes to supporting Ukraine to a full extent. Owing to fears about nuclear attacks or World War III, the White House has created imaginary Russian red lines, thus offering Russia a sanctuary from Ukrainian attacks with Western arms. Although, since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Europe and the United States have supported Ukraine to an extent unimaginable before the Russian invasion. However, the deliveries rarely arrive in the required numbers, as was the case with the 31 Abrams tanks, a quantity that is laughably small given the needs. Or they were delayed by lengthy debates, as was the case with the much-discussed ATACMS or F-16, for example. The United States gives us too little to even stop Russia from advancing, Ukrainian military analyst Ivan Kryshevsky said in an interview. And it's not just about the insufficient quantities of weapons being delivered, but also the limited variety of equipment provided to the Ukrainians. Carolina Hurd, an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, sees this as a problem of both scale and speed. Western aid is not yet necessarily arriving at the scale necessary for Ukrainian forces to fully turn the tide, she added. One of the most critical challenges in US support for Ukraine is the slow pace of aid delivery, which directly affects Ukraine's combat capabilities. While the US has committed substantial resources, the process of getting military aid to Ukraine is often hampered by bureaucratic hurdles and logistical complexities. The types of weapons provided do not always align with Ukraine's immediate needs. While the US has supplied artillery, armored vehicles, and air defense systems, Ukraine lacks sufficient long-range strike capabilities to disrupt Russian supply lines or engage targets deep inside occupied territories. The US has imposed restrictions on using certain advanced weapon systems such as ATACMS, which could reach border regions of Russia that are used for attacks on Ukraine. Even though recent policy adjustments have allowed limited use of these systems, constraints still prevent Ukraine from leveraging their strategic potential against Russian operations. Another issue is how exactly the White House and the Pentagon regulate the process of transferring weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Weapons are sent quickly, but replacing them is slow, often supporting US industry more than helping Ukraine right away. These constraints are also influenced by internal politics. Political debates in Congress often delay the approval of aid packages. The aid often includes provisions that align with broader US strategic goals, such as increased military presence in Europe or intelligence operations related to Ukraine. These provisions can dilute the direct impact of aid on the Ukrainian battlefield and even the lives of civilians. For instance, during crucial battles, Ukrainian forces faced severe shortages of artillery shells and air defense munitions due to delays in US aid approval, which allowed Russia to exploit weaknesses in Ukrainian defenses. Even more persuasive is President Zelensky's recent admission that it was impossible to save one of Ukraine's largest thermal power plants from destruction because, at a crucial moment, there simply weren't enough anti-aircraft missiles to defend it during yet another massive Russian air raid. All these constraints might be the US's way of avoiding escalation into a broader confrontation with Russia. The fear is that such weapons might enable Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory, potentially widening the conflict. Or, as Ukrainian experience shows, when the US starts talking about the need to avoid escalation, it could simply mean that they don't have anything to give. They just can't publicly admit it, which might also be a political issue. The biggest problem, though, is that the US approach has been to keep Ukraine in the fight rather than enable a decisive victory. Ukrainian officials frequently point out that while the US aid helps stabilize the front lines, it does not provide the necessary firepower to launch a major counteroffensive or significantly alter the war's course in Ukraine's favor. Despite their proven effectiveness in defense and destroying Russian armored groups, Ukraine received only 300 Bradleys to cover nearly 870 miles of the front line. For comparison, a US armored brigade would typically have 125 Bradleys to cover just 9 miles of the front. This shortage forces Ukraine to stretch its resources thin, often reacting to Russian moves rather than taking control of the battlefield. Now it is to be feared that support will not only delay, but will decrease. The prolonged debates in the US Congress over the aid for Ukraine in early 2024 suggest that the next funding package might not be as generous. Even if Vice President Kamala Harris clinches the presidency in November, the US is likely to shift its stance, urging European nations to shoulder more of the financial and military burden. It is likely to happen because there is a growing bipartisan push within the US for more restrained foreign engagement and a shift in security policy priorities. This sentiment is not limited to Trump or MAGA Republicans, but extends to broader Republican and even some Democratic factions. US defense planning has pivoted towards the Indo-Pacific region and their strategic competition with China. The Pentagon's budget allocations reflect this shift, with significantly higher funding directed towards the Pacific Deterrence Initiative compared to the European Deterrence Initiative. This strategic focus on China over Russia signals a broader realignment of US resources and military priorities, thereby limiting the extent of US involvement in Europe. But here's the catch: Europe isn't prepared. The idea of joint European borrowing to arm Kyiv faces stiff opposition, and Ukraine's support is already competing with other budget priorities and being used as a tool in election campaigns. According to a YouGov and Data Praxis survey conducted in January 2024, European public confidence in Ukraine's chances of victory is low. Only 10% of Europeans across 12 countries believe Ukraine will win, with a larger percentage expecting a Russian victory or a settlement. This pessimism affects public support for ongoing aid, as many prefer pushing Ukraine towards a settlement rather than prolonged support for military victory. For example, in Austria, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and Romania, there is a clear tendency to push for a negotiated settlement, showing diverging public opinions on how their governments should act. Although Ukraine's closest neighbors were initially seen as its biggest supporters, the European countries survey shows waning solidarity even in these regions. In Poland, traditionally a strong backer of Ukraine, only 17% of respondents believe Ukraine will win. Hungary and Romania also show high expectations for a Russian victory and a preference for a settlement, reflecting concerns about the war's impact and Ukraine's future. However, this survey was conducted before the impressive Kursk operation, which significantly impacted public opinion and boosted Ukraine's image globally. But it's not just about politics. Obviously, European countries have far fewer capabilities for weapon production compared to the US. America's output, from ammunition to missiles, makes it the backbone of Ukraine's military support. The key takeaway is that while Kamala Harris vocally supports Ukraine, the US as a whole operates with broader priorities. On a smaller scale, it might seem like it's all about Trump or Kamala, but in the grander scheme, much more is at play. This picture underpins the reality that key Western allies, particularly the US and Germany, have made it clear that their goal isn't to defeat Russia outright, but to weaken it. They fear that a total Russian defeat might provoke dangerous escalations, such as the use of nuclear weapons or even the disintegration of the Russian state. These risks seem more daunting to them than a potential Ukrainian defeat. prompting Western leaders to place limits on their military support for Ukraine rather than imposing clear boundaries on Russian aggression. The question remains whether Kyiv will have enough military strength to both defend itself and liberate occupied territories, but the new US president will definitely have the power to influence the outcome. What do you think the US and its allies should do to navigate this war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.